Storey Time with Stephanie Storey.
Hi, I am art and historical novelist Stephanie Storey, and my guest here today, I'm going to warn you, we are going to be, no doubt, geeking out about history and Italy with the author of The Violinist of Venice, The Most Beautiful Woman in Florence, The Spellbook of Katrina von Tassel, and the Borgia Confessions, out just earlier this year. Welcome to the show, Alyssa Palombo.
Hi, Stephanie. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited.
Yeah, I'm just excited to talk about Italy and history with you because I know where my obsession with Italy started. You know, it started with the art of Michelangelo and Raphael, but you obviously have an obsession with the country, writing about Venice and Florence and Rome. Where did your obsession with Italy start?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. One of how I really got interested in Italy's history was actually the Borgias were kind of my way in. When I was a teenager, a friend's mom, who is also a huge reader, she lent me a book called The Borgia Bride by Jean Calligridis. I think I'm pronouncing her name correctly. And so that was the first time I had ever heard of the Borgias, and I hadn't really read too much set in Renaissance Italy before then, or in Italy at all. I loved historical fiction. I had been reading a lot of like stuff about the Tudors. They were kind of big at the time, and I was getting a little bored with them because I had kind of read almost everything, you know, that was out there. And so I read this book about the Borgias, and I was like, wow, I've never heard of these people. This is so fascinating. How did I never know about this? And that kind of was my entry point into Italian history, actually. And then when years later was when I ended up getting the idea for The Violinist of Venice, which is obviously set, you know, different place in Italy, different time period. But then that really kind of solidified it for me. And actually for that book, the music, as a musician, like the music was sort of my way into that. And then in researching that book, I went to Italy for the first time, and then I was just sold.
Okay, already with that first question, I have 8 questions. So I'm going to start with, since you started with the Borgia family, and that's where your interest started, but it took you 4 books to get, this is your 4th book, right?
Yeah.
4 books in order to get to writing about them. What was that Borgia journey like for you?
Yeah, so yeah, I read kind of that first historical novel about them, and then I went on and read some nonfiction. I read pretty much any other novels about them I could find. But as a writer, I always wanted to write something about them, but I kind of could never get at the story. And then actually, it's interesting that you asked, because the Borgia Confessions, I started several times and kind of kept coming back to in between the other books. And it just like was never right. It was like never the right time. I kind of felt like it was missing a piece. You know, after I handed in Violinist, my first novel, to my editor, I went back to it and I was like, okay, this is going to be my 2nd book. And it wasn't. And then after I turned in The Most Beautiful Woman in Florence, I went back to it again. And my agent said, you know, I like what you have so far, but it feels like something's missing. So then I ended up writing The Spellbook of Katrina von Tassel. And then after that book was done, I had 2 other projects I was kind of playing around with. And then I came up with the idea of adding the second point of view to the Borgia book, the point of view of Maddalena, who's a servant who works for the family. It had always been Cesare's point of view. And that kind of didn't feel like enough somehow. And so then I came up with the idea of adding in the second point of view. And that was when I felt like I was onto something, and my agent agreed. And so that was kind of what got me there for that project. And then 2, that was actually the fall of 2016. And after the presidential election, I felt like I wanted to write something about power and politics and corruption and all of that stuff. So then that really felt like the time for that book finally.
And women versus men and how that all plays out. I mean, that's a major part of this book when you added the Maddalena, right? That's how you say her name? Okay.
Yes, Maddalena.
You know, when you read them, you sometimes think, am I pronouncing this character's name? Because it is really interesting for you to take the reader into the skin of one of the most villainous, not nice people in history, in Cesare Borgia. So one, can you tell people at home a little bit about him and what made you want to tell the story from his point of view?
So Cesare Borgia was one of the sons of Pope Alexander VI, probably his oldest son. He was made, when his father was elected Pope, he was made the Archbishop of Valencia, and then shortly thereafter after at the age of 18, he was made a cardinal because his father's plan was that he should follow him into the church, and he eventually wanted him to be elected Pope years down the road. And Pope Alexander kind of wanted to create this Borgia dynasty for his family. Cesare didn't want to do that. He didn't want to be in the church. He wanted a general. So he was kind of, dragged kicking and screaming into that life. That's, again, a very simplified version. So what drew me to writing about him is that, first of all, I don't know if there's too many or any other novels about the Borgias from Cesare's point of view, in English anyway. And to me, he's the real villain of kind of a family that gets vilified quite often. And so I like a good villain story, a villain narrative. So I wanted to really explore how he got that way. Like, what's his villain origin story? So that was kind of how I was thinking of this book as I wrote it. Like, this is his villain origin story.
A villain origin story of Cesare Borgia. That is what it is. But I was so glad and relieved to have the point of view of Maddalena, because it humanized the whole world a little bit better than just being with, Cesare Borgia is a horrible person. So what did that give you, and what did that give you as the writer to see the world through her point of view?
Yeah, so I wanted to kind of show the situation from the point of view of somebody who was very powerful in this world and at this time, and somebody who had no power. And then also, what is it like when somebody who doesn't have power kind of comes into proximity with that sort of power, and what does that do to that person? But also just to balance the two viewpoints, because I think a lot of historical fiction, you see the point of view of the powerful, of the wealthy, and things like that. So I thought it would be interesting to bring in the perspective of a working class person, an ordinary person who is really affected in momentous ways by the decisions these powerful people are making, in ways that those people themselves sometimes are not.
One of the other things you mentioned early on is that you are a musician. You're a trained mezzo-soprano, and so your first book is about Vivaldi, right?
Yes.
So how did you transition from being a trained musician into being a writer, and how does that music background serve you as a writer now, beyond just the fact that you've written about Vivaldi?
Yeah, so when I started to write that book, I was in college, and I was doing a lot of music classes, music lessons, and that was when I really got fully into the whole kind of world of classical music. So that book kind of came out of my own personal musical renaissance. But I think as a writer, I think as any kind of artist, it's good to have different ways to kind of flex your creative muscles. And, writing and creating is its own thing. And then as a performer, you're performing the music of others. I don't write music myself. I wish I could. So it's more of an interpretive art. So to me, it really is like the flexing of the different creative muscles. And I think it strengthens both. Like doing one kind of makes you better at the other, because again, they are different. So they sort of inform each other. I'm trying to think of a concrete way to sort of explain that.
There may not be a concrete way.
Yeah,
it may be sort of a mushy thing.
I think it is. I think it is, because I think, when you're writing something, you're sort of in charge of this world that you're creating, right? And I think as a musician, you kind of get to put yourself at the service of this work of art. You don't have to create it. You just have to interpret it, and you just have to live within it, but it's already there for you to step into. And it's just a different experience. And I think that, for a writer, experience is everything. You can always draw from experiences, and just having those experiences sort of enriches your writing.
Okay, so speaking of experiences, tell me, so you had already gotten into Italian history through the Borgias before you ever went to Italy. Tell me, how old were you? When did you go? Where did you go? What was the experience like of going? Because you became so obsessed with it. That first moment of being there had to have had a major impact on you. So
yeah. So I went in 2013, so I would have been, I think I was 24. Yeah. That sounds right. I can't do math. And I went with my mom, and we did we actually went on a Rick Steves tour. So we went to Venice, we went to Florence, and we went to Rome. And I had been researching violinists for years. And so I really just needed to go and see Venice. That was kind of the missing piece, is I have to see how people move around in this space and just get kind of a feel for it. And I went to some of the locations that were in the book and things like that too. I remember kind of my first experience of Italy was, coming on this boat, and you just see this city floating in the water. It's amazing. It was just so magical. And I remember the boat kind of went across in front of Piazza San Marco, and reading about this place and researching it for so long. And then I was finally sold. It was really cool.
So does that mean that Venice is your favorite because you've written about Venice, Florence, Rome? Does this mean Venice is still lives in your heart as your favorite, or which city is your favorite?
Oh, Venice is definitely my favorite. I love Rome very deeply. The first time on that first trip when I went there, we were only there a few days, and I found it kind of overwhelming. And I also got really sick while we were there. I had the worst cold or something. It was awful. But then when I was researching the Borgia Confessions, I went back and I stayed 6 days or a week, and I really got to know Rome a lot better, and I really got to explore it a lot. And that was when I really fell in love with Rome. So Venice is my favorite, but Rome comes in a close second for me.
Did you always know you wanted to be a writer? Was this something you did since you were a kid, and this was the big goal, and you did it at a young age? What was that like for you?
Yeah, pretty much. Ever since I was a kid, I used to write down little stories about anything. I started making stuff up. I think a lot of maybe creative kids start this way, but you have Barbies or dolls or whatever, and you kind of make up stories with them. So I started there. And then once I got a little older, I would just sit, my family had an old clunky computer back in the 90s, and I would just sit there and I would write down these stories. And so that was always my dream, was to be a published author and have a writing career. So yeah, I kept at it. I kept at it till I got published. I have, like all writers do, I have plenty of manuscripts that I wrote before Violinist that are never going to see the light of day because they're awful, but you had to write, those not so great books to get to the one that was good enough.
Mm-hmm. Has it met your expectations of what you thought it would be when you were young? Has it not met, how has that been for you, becoming a novelist, I guess is what I'm asking about?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there about the publishing industry and what it's actually like to write books, right? So I definitely fell into some of those when I was younger. You think that, well, you get a book deal and you can quit your day job. Well, no. in most cases, no. And then, there's kind of this Hollywood or this TV vision of I'm thinking of Carrie Bradshaw's fancy book party in New York and going on a big book tour, and those things do happen, but that's kind of the exception rather than the rule. So I think there's kind of that glamorous side that, you have this idea in your head that it's kind of like that. And it's not usually, but that doesn't mean that the work itself is any less rewarding, for me at least. I write because I love it. I write because I kind of have this compulsion to tell stories. So, would I love to have a fabulous Carrie Bradshaw-esque book launch party? Sure. But, that doesn't, even if I never do, that doesn't mean that this, that's not what it's about, I guess is what I'm saying. But yeah.
You are young enough where you still have a lot of career ahead of you. So what do you still hope to accomplish in the writing career, the writing career you have left?
Mm-hmm.
And what do you hope people take away from your books? I think those questions are sort of related because they sort of go hand in hand with what are you hoping to accomplish and what do you hope people take away from what you write?
Yeah. So, what I'm hoping to accomplish is that I just have a lot of books I want to write. I have a lot of stories I think would be fun to tell, and I just want to get the chance to write those and to share those with people. In terms of what people take from my books, I hope that, that they enjoy reading it, that they find it, a fun experience. I love books that are kind of like an armchair travel kind of thing. And so I hope my books do that for people. I think in all of mine, especially I'm always thinking about what it was like for women in history. And I hope that people take away a sense of, how far we've come as women. and also how far we still have to go. Like, I think certainly in my books, there are some things where you might look at and say, well, you know, that unfortunately hasn't really changed all that much between now and, you know, the 1400s. So I think that awareness would be good. And just, you know, if people can learn something new as well, learn something about a person or a place or a time period they didn't know about. I love when I learn something new from a book and I'm kind of being entertained and I'm learning something at the same time. Yeah, but I think, you know, yeah, I think thought about what has changed and what hasn't over history. And, you know, that idea of there's nothing new under the sun. I think more people should look back to history and see that, you know, this has all happened before and what can we learn from that?
Are all of the stories you want to tell historical, and are all the stories you want to tell Italian, or do you move around?
So no, I think I'll kind of always come back to Italy and come back to historical fiction because that's sort of my first love. But no, I have some ideas for contemporary stories. Also, I could see myself branching out into like fantasy or historical fantasy. That's something that really interests me. Like, you know, taking some history or taking a historical setting or something and kind of putting a twist on it. There's a lot of authors now that do that really well, I think. And that's something that's really interesting to me and seems like it would be fun to write. So yeah, I see myself definitely branching out, but I don't know that I would ever, you know, completely leave behind historical fiction.
Okay, I have one last art question I have to ask, because you know I'm an art geek. And you wrote a book called The Most Beautiful Woman in Florence, and
Yes.
it's about Botticelli and one of his models. What was the most interesting thing you learned about Botticelli? Tell me some Botticelli story.
So I think actually one of the most interesting Botticelli anecdotes was kind of the thing that inspired this book in the first place. So the book is about Simonetta Vespucci, who was a real woman, and she's supposed to be the woman in his painting, The Birth of Venus. And actually, if you look at a lot of his paintings, it's her. He painted her over and over again. It's, you know, even if you don't know who she is, you can see that it's the same woman. But so he supposedly was kind of desperately in love with her, and she tragically died very young. And so when he died, he asked to be buried at her feet, and he actually was. And so that learning that was kind of like what set me on the path of wanting to write this book.
I did not know that. I did not know that he was buried at her feet. I mean, I know it's the same woman. I mean, again, like you said, I know what she looks like. I know a little bit.
Yeah.
I did not know that. I learned something new about Botticelli today. That's fascinating. That is great.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
You can actually go, he's buried in the Church of the Ognissanti in Florence, like right along the Arno. And so when I was there researching the book, I actually went there and I saw where he was buried, and, you know, then just kind of feet away is where Simona is buried. So that was, it was one of those emotional moments for sure.
I didn't notice that part. I've seen Botticelli's grave. I just didn't notice her, because you're not looking for her. I guess it's not. That's fascinating. Okay, good. Now I got to go read about Botticelli. Okay. Thank you, Alyssa. This was lovely to sit down and have a talk with you about Italy and history and all of these fabulous
Story time
things.
with Stephanie, story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories in a novel way. Story time with Stephanie.